Thank you. It's a delight to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm actually a wash ashore from Los Angeles. If you want to count the details, I'm actually a Bostonian. Actually, I'm a Cape Codder, and spent 40 years of my life there as a professor at Boston College, and I co-founded an organization there called the Urban Ecology Institute. And it was from that work that I became committed to underserved communities and thinking about what this transformation needs to look like with respect to STEM education, workforce development, and empowering communities that have been forgotten for way too long. My undergraduate and graduate training is in biology. I'm an ecologist, and I have, through our work, been doing long-term studies where citizen science was a central part. My doctoral study that became my fundamental piece of work was with an endangered shorebird called the piping plover. You have snowy plovers out here, same genus, different species. And that work went for almost 20 years. And in the academic world, no one's going to fund you to do work for that long. The grants come and go, but the need doesn't. And nature is complicated, and especially when you move into natural systems that are impacted by humans. In fact, where on earth are there systems not impacted by humans? It becomes even more complicated. And in the scientific world, it's hard to separate the signal from the noise. And the way you do that is to gather lots of data. And the way you do that is to involve communities of people who are stakeholders. Because we can't pay what we need to for the kinds of work that we need. It's one of the challenges in our particular democracy. We have a lot of money for certain things, but other certain things tend to get forgotten. And the idea is, well, you can get volunteers to do that. Well, these are actually important decisions we're making based on the future of the Earth. And so this combination of recognizing the tremendous need of underserved communities and the tremendous power of citizen science, which we now call community science, was a turning point, at least in my career, in thinking about how science really serves the community. How do we really prepare this next generation of young people to face the kinds of challenges that really seem overwhelming and in some ways daunting? So I had the opportunity about 6 years ago, LMU, Loyola Marymount University, my home institution now, was celebrating their 100th year, installing a new president, and the new president gets to pick a presidential professor to assume an endowed chair. And I was invited to come out. I'd never been to Los Angeles before. And so when you fly in at night to Los Angeles, and it starts somewhere in Fontana, the sea of lights. Remember, there's more people in Los Angeles than all of New England put together in an area smaller than Rhode Island. So the sea of lights, and finally, the plane lands. And I'm so freaked out, I think if I just stay on the plane and keep my head down, it'll eventually turn around and fly back. So I'm calling my wife from the phone, and I said, because, you know, in Cape Cod, I lived in a house that was built in the 1700s, held together with wooden pegs, with an old sea captain's house. It had no locks on the doors. So it was very different arriving here, but also quite extraordinary. And it didn't take long for the kind of people that I met in the first few months that I was here. People like Ruth Galanter, the retired city councilwoman, the folks from Tree People, the folks here. This was one of the first schools I was brought to. And I said, wow, there's such an extraordinary opportunity to be in service to a city that's such an extraordinary experiment. You know, Los Angeles, all of Boston's only 300,000 people. It was a lot of universities, so it has a higher profile than you would expect for its size. You know, punches above its weight, as we would say. But Los Angeles could be in the G20 if it were its own country. You have 14 million people. In fact, you have the lowest carbon footprint per person of any city in America. You have the third largest ridership on a daily basis of public transportation. But yet that's not what you hear about Los Angeles. You know, we think of Los Angeles as being about branding and imagery and very shallow, and, you know, but no, you come here, look at everybody here. You're hardworking. You could be doing something else today. right? And for those of you who are celebrating Rosh Hashanah, it's incredible to have you here with us. This is an amazing urban experiment, probably the most important city in the world right now as we think about the lessons that we can learn and share with other communities. We're a gateway to Asia, we're a gateway to the Americas. It's a very powerful community that's speaking hundreds of languages and managing to cope with the tremendous turmoil of increasingly rapid change. You know, I was in graduate school in the 1980s. I was warned that it was going to be very difficult as an educator to keep up with science because knowledge is doubling every 20 years. And I thought that was impossible for me to keep pace with. And the most recent findings by the national academies based on publication rates and data gathering, scientific knowledge is doubling every 16 weeks. And you're all gatekeepers to this next generation of people who are being confronted with the kind of media storm that they live in. Can you imagine what it's like to be 14 years old now and be tweeted and Facebooked and all of these things constantly with sort of no editorial value applied? When I was growing up, whatever I was confronted with went through at least some levels of editorial review. But now anyone with a laptop can publish slick-looking information, and you've got young people who are struggling to figure out where's the truth in all of this. And say, okay, we're a great country, so let me listen to my presidential candidates. Truth must be there. Need we say any more? But you know, that's the nation that we've become in a sense. These people are servants of us. We sort of invented this reality that you now are trying to steer a generation of young people through so that they can be skeptical but positive, right? Because skeptical and depressed leads to a nihilistic, sort of angry generation that Europe went through in the 1970s, and it nearly cost them their sort of global prescience. If it wasn't for the EU, they would have not been able to maintain the capacity and then sort of rebound. And we're at this point right now. I mean, you actually look, the cost of food is lower than it's been ever in the history of the United States. There's still too many people that are hungry. Our overall crime rates are actually dropping, but yet it's not what we see. What we see are these ruptures and tears in the fabric of our social engagement with each other. It's kind of tragic to watch young people on a date right now. They'll sit in front of each other in a restaurant, each with their own cell phones. Waitress will come, they'll order. I have daughters, I have to deal with this. I said, we're going to get together tonight and no one is going to bring a cell phone to the table. We moved the television out of the living room because it was just getting insane. We have to look at each other. See, we have faces, we have expressions. Most of the things we say are nonverbal. Is anything more dangerous than a tweet or a text? There's no emotion with it, there's no face. You take the information the wrong way. And so it's a very interesting time. Our information transfer rate is nonlinear and expanding, but yet the quality of our ability to make decisions about the knowledge in front of us is eroding. And you guys get to handle all of this. You are in loco parentis, you are the local parents of these children, you're providing services that were unimagined 50 years ago. Some of the students you work with arrive early in the morning and leave at night, you're feeding them 3 meals, both intellectually and physically before they go home. And so it's a fascinating time. There's so much possibility and so much potential capacity, and so much is trivialized and wasted as a result. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the field of urban ecology, how it links to STEM education. And then I want to do a very short primer on the services we provide at the Center for Urban Resilience. So when I accepted the position in Los Angeles, the idea was that we would take what we learned in Boston, where we had developed 2 major curricula. One was a biology book called Biology: The Web of Life, which was published by Pearson. If you guys teach from those books, it's the Wolf book. I was the lead author on that, and there was a television series that I hosted that went with it. But I got very disappointed with them because they had more money. They had mountains of money. It was like the Medellin cartel, but it had to do with book publishing. And And all these promises they sort of made about the way we'd reach out into communities, it really didn't happen. Sales just mounted up. And so we did a couple of editions of that. It went very well, but it was not what I thought we were going to do. And so in founding this not-for-profit in Boston, the Urban Ecology Institute, with two colleagues, both of which were lawyers, one of which was Max Kennedy, who was one of Robert Kennedy's sons, who splits his time between LA and Cape Cod. We decided that we would do the things that the publishers promised to do but didn't. So it'd have to be a Robin Hood model. We'd have to raise funds. We'd have to raise funds from federal agencies for the science that we were doing, and we received 7 grants from the National Science Foundation, U.S. Department of Education, and so forth. And then we'd have to reach out to other foundations to support the work that went into the communities. And so as we'll talk about a little later, it's a bit of an extended Robin Hood model. The teachers that work with us receive stipends, summer support, equipment, and our staff at the schools. And so we're indebted. We've now had 11 grants from the National Science Foundation. We're currently working under 3 grants right now, and other funding agencies as well. And we're going to make this PowerPoint available to you. If there's a take-home here, you want to go to this website, and that's where all the curriculum resources are. You'll get it later, and it's also on my card, and it's also on the flyer that's in the other room. That you can have access to. We have over 100 lessons right now, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So I don't need to reinforce to you that the world has changed dramatically, and especially so with the impact of human transformation following the technological revolution of the Industrial Revolution. Once we were able to extract high-density carbon from the ground in the form of coal and oil, we were able to have such high-density energy sources that we could begin to make machines mobile. And in doing so, we started to move around. We started to transform our agricultural processes. And so really, for the first time, it only happened a few hundred years ago, we actually began to produce surpluses of food and materials, more than the world could use in a given year. Once you start doing that, it's very interesting because it allows people no longer to be expected that they would be part of a food production and gathering community. They could become specialized in other forms of labor. And that cycle of high density materials to create energy, you can put 10 gallons of gasoline in an automobile and travel 500 miles. That's a pretty extraordinary thing to do. If you want to do that with human labor or you want to do that with animal labor, it's going to be a much bigger operation to go 500 miles in a day. Many of you will, on a Friday, jump and go 500 miles up to San Francisco to visit family or something like that, and it's become routine. That would be a single trip of a lifetime only a couple of hundred years ago. Of course, there's implications for that, right? As we oxidize carbon and release it to the atmosphere, we have released sources of greenhouse gases that were compartmentalized in areas where they were out of the Earth's metabolism. So, climate change isn't magic. It's just we've been incredibly efficient at oxidizing materials that had been sequestered for 100 million years. We've released it. At the same time, we moved a lot of people around, and we've done a lot with machinery, and we've transformed science, we've transformed medicine, we've transformed the production of food, we've transformed how we've interacted with one another, and boom, and it all happened in about 200 years. That pace of change. It took 1 million years for the first billion people to be on the planet, and now we're adding 1 billion people every 17 years. China alone is adding 1 million people to cities every month. Every year they build the equivalent of Los Angeles. China has used more cement in the past 3 years than the United States did in the past 100. By the way, the production of cement is one of the largest producers of greenhouse gases. That and the consumption of meat, because most of the animals we choose to eat are fermenters. And the greenhouse gas, by the way, doesn't come out the back end, comes out the front end. It's a great tool for teaching this relationship between the trophic cascades of how energy moves through ecosystems. We have some of that in our curriculum. But I love this image because it shows the hyperconcentration of humans. This is the cumulative light given off from cities in North America and part of Central America, in the Caribbean. And you can see these clusters around Chicago, the megalopolis that runs from Portland, Maine to Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, and so forth. These hyper-clusterings of people, as crazy as it may sound, and I accept this thesis now, hold tomatoes till the end, it is the hyper-clustering of the ultimately 10 billion people that we'll be in service to by the end of this century. It's the only way we can create a sustainable and resilient planet with that many people. Because as you hyper-cluster people, their carbon footprints go down, their use of private transportation is reduced, their engagement in public resources goes up, and so really the trick here is how do we make cities livable, resilient, and people tell us they love where they live. That's the most important measure of resilience in public health and social science. But the way that cities have historically grown has been very unhealthy, and this is part of the revelation that has been associated with cheap petroleum. So if we take a look, and the biggest period of growth in this country was from 1970 to 1990. Credit became available, there was a big boom, and it's just extraordinary to see that, you know, places like Chicago, which were really legacy cities, only grew by about 4%, but the amount of land use grew by 50%. New York, 8% growth, 65% increase in land. Seattle, significant growth, almost 100% increase in land. And then here's our beloved Los Angeles, the poster child for sprawl. We increased population by about 50% in 20 years, land use by 300%. Because you had a choice, right? You could live in a clustered area and it was really expensive, but depending on how long you're willing to drive, you could have more and more land when you got there. And that's true around the country, but it's most accelerated in places like Los Angeles, whose weather does not inhibit you doing that. So if you want to live in Boston and you want to live 100 miles away from work, at least 4 or 5 months out of the year, getting to work might take 9 hours because the highways will be going 5 or 6 miles an hour because of snow. In Los Angeles, we have other reasons why highways are traveling at 5 or 6 miles an hour, but theoretically, you're not limited as to the time of year in which you can be commuting. So layer this technological growth and technological opportunity. I like this image. This image was from, you remember there was a film that came out about 3 years ago about this apocalyptic war that was going to happen in Los Angeles, and I had just moved here, and so I'm not used to driving down the street and being assaulted with movie and television signs every 100 yards. You know, we're too conservative for that in Boston. You go every 100 yards, a sign for a bank. You should save your money here. You should save your money there. You should save and then you should feel guilty and save your money here. That's sort of what we do in New England. It's our, you know, Puritan Catholic background, always looking down. And it rains once every 3 days, and those hedonists in Los Angeles with sun and tans and cars without roofs. It's just. So typical Bostonian would say, and what's wrong with this picture? So the image that's supposed to be here instead of the upside down question marks, not even right side up question marks, is that it was working fine a moment ago, is some data showing the lopsided impact of our current global economy. It's the real war we fight. The data here was showing that there are literally trillions of dollars of productivity that we are negative in based on our manufacturing capacity in the United States. We used to be a nation of manufacturers. Los Angeles arguably was one of the most important contributors to the victory of the Allies in the Second World War, because you guys cranked out airplanes and war material and everything along boats. You and Long Island in New York basically won the war. The last airplane in Southern California was built 2 years ago. Aircraft production in Southern California is dead. However, drive into El Segundo, all the manufacturers are still there. They're there because the US Air Force Base is giving away $10 billion a year in research contracts to design the wave of technology. We'll build it somewhere else, but we're going to design it here. I have a colleague of mine who works for Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins is in Baltimore. They built a campus next to the Los Angeles Air Force Base. There are no students there, just researchers, because there's so much money available for research. His lab does about $15 million of research each year, and he can't hire enough people. He has to go overseas to bring them in. And of course, he's working on some things that are top secret, so they can't get clearance. So he has money sitting on the table he can't even spend. And if you're a research scientist, remember it's only about, even if you're really successful, only about 1 out of every 7 grants you apply for do you get funded. He gets funded and can't spend the money. It's like unbelievable. Well, that's curious. Oh, this one at least came through. Another measure of our productivity with respect to our capacity in the sciences has to do with the total science and engineering articles that are being published on an annual basis. And it used to be the United States was the absolute leader in scientific productivity, but we have now been passed by Europe, and it won't be long before Asia is publishing more scientific documents than we are. And by the way, a lot of documents being produced. I mean, we're still publishing 180,000 journal articles a year. There's a lot of science being produced, but we were at one time the envy of the rest of the world, both for our manufacturing and our science content. And this is what we call soft power. You know, the Cold War has kind of wound its way down, thank goodness. And so the real power of any community are its people. And so how do we get our community of young people to be part of this extraordinary success? Sent to you a few moments ago showed an updated version of this leaking STEM pipeline. I still use the original because I love the imagery, and it's actually getting worse than it was here. But with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a group, the U.S. cohort high school class of 2005 was followed through their potential years as undergraduates in college. And of the 4 million students that graduated in 2001, only about 1.8 million had college plans. Of those, only about 1.3 were college ready. A little over 250,000 were majoring in STEM, and of those, only 160,000 ever graduated with science degrees. 4% of our young people. And yet we have the most extraordinary educational infrastructure of any nation. So we have a tremendous problem both in preparedness and with the internal compass that our young people are guiding their lives by with respect to this relationship to science, technology, engineering, and math. And I think we need to add the arts to this as well, because most of modern arts are highly technical and highly skilled components. And so how do we start with essentially healthy and eager minds, and somehow along the way they become disinterested in science? It's especially tragic with young women, because young women outperform young men until about the 6th or 7th grade. It's not magic. Young women tend to develop faster, and as nutrition has gotten even better, young women are developing even faster. But in the end, you know, we have about 4% of our graduating high school students going into the sciences, and it's one of the few areas where we are leaders and have excess capacity to provide jobs. And it's so critical because our impact on the environment is so gigantic. I mean, here, just one example of deforestation. It wasn't that long ago that we were destroying 1% of the rainforest per year on the planet. We've changed that a little bit by a whole variety of incentives and other processes, but it's still arguably the most important negative land transforming process is deforestation. We don't understand it. We haven't responded to it well. Remember, for climate change now, mitigation is taking a back seat. We need to work on adaptation. Even if we were to roll back carbon dioxide levels to 1960 levels, we'd still heat the oceans for another 100 years. So climate change is happening, and it's irreversible at this point, and so we need to be adaptive. And the last thing in the world you want to do is to cut down your natural system of carbon sequestration and oxygen production and temperature mitigation. Trees do all these ecosystem services for us. But you ask the public a word like ecosystem services, and there's not a general recognition about that relationship we have to nature. And in fact, it's even worse because we don't think of our cities as contributing positively to ecosystem services. And of course they can. So in our curriculum and in the industry in general in urban ecology, you know, when we study the life sciences, when we study the sciences at all, we're basically asking questions about how are things variable? What is the diversity that we see? And in biological systems, that's from the molecular to the biosphere. But we're changing in the way that we are structuring this relationship. So biological diversity is critical in that it serves ecosystem services. Biologically diverse communities have redundancy. If you're in a car wreck, you'd like an airbag and a seat belt. And you'd like to have the crash beams in the doors. And you'd like to have the crumple zones on the cars. And you'd like to have a gas tank that's isolated. It's those multiple systems that help you walk away and be resilient from an auto crash that would have killed your grandfather. We complain that our cars are so expensive to repair. Yes, they are, because when you decide to decelerate from 50 to 0 in a few feet, that's a lot of heat to generate. And so your cars crumple, and it slows down the process enough so that your brain isn't jiggled too much, and you get to walk away. Otherwise, that energy is transferred to you, and you get to be carried out in a sack. And so, you know, this kind of resilience is easy to understand when you put it into the proper context as the ability to persist, adapt, and transform in the face of shock. And the biggest shock that we have to deal with in the 21st century is this response to global environmental change, because ultimately we have to live within our planetary boundaries. If we think about the Brundtland Report, which is still the most important thing that we have in global response to the challenge of sustainability, we think of the sustainable and resilient developments are those that meet the present needs without compromising the ability of future generations. So how do we build that kind of recognition in? Because the challenge is that humans are an integral part of the Earth's ecosystems, and cities are distinct ecosystems in and of themselves. They are not an imposition on the landscape. They are a transformed landscape in and of themselves. So when I was in graduate school, I wanted to do work in urban ecology, and I was told that if I did that, I would never get a job as a professor, because people would look at my resume and they would say, you couldn't get a grant to go do work somewhere interesting. So you had to stay in the city. Because everybody knew ecology in the 1980s meant an airplane ride and then increasingly primitive transportation till an ox cart drops me off the top of a mountain and I pick up my binoculars and I become transformed by nature in front of me. I blame it on the fact the early ecologists couldn't get a date to the prom. And so we all kind of grew up hating people. That's how we ended up. My friends were dogs, you know. So we like animals, we don't even like people. Go visit the Natural History Museum, as Sandy was talking about. Those people are great. And some of them like to come out. Some of them are like kind of gray and they're kind of down in the, you know, and they're wonderful because they know so much. And they say, why don't you come and talk to my school? It's like, are there people there? You know. So, sometimes, but don't worry, the young people, they're not really listening to you. So the trick is, in this context of urban ecology, is to understand that the Earth's ecosystems and human cities and cultures are fully integrated. They are forcers. They are drivers and forcers that impact each other. So when we talk about the health of an ecosystem, it's as important to talk about public health and food equity and social equity, because if those aren't in balance, you will never achieve the goal of clean air, clean water, and clean soils. Because humans are the most important ecosystem drivers or ecosystem engineers on the planet. So when you look at a picture like this, Vicenti's seen this picture and so have others, and I bring it up because we now have a contract with the city of Long Beach to help them manage their coyote problem, and we have a contract with the city of Colton to manage their coyote problem, and I just spent 3 hours talking to a group of 300 angry Westchesters types on the west side of Los Angeles with their sort of pitchforks, and they were ready to get all revved up. And because, you know, those are sort of landed folks, and think, you know, with the taxes I pay, I shouldn't have problems. Kind of like the Aliso Canyon folks with the gas underneath. They pay so much for their land and their homes, there shouldn't be problems, right? I should be able to buy my way out of this. He's saying, well, actually, it gets pretty warm in Los Angeles, and you know, when electricity travels through wires and it gets hot, resistance goes up, so we can't actually generate enough electricity and bring it in, so we have to generate it locally. We use natural gas. We use the gas under the Aliso Canyon. We don't use the gas to heat homes. We use the gas to run air conditioners, ultimately. So it's like, oh, is that how it works? And so you know, coyotes are running amok in communities all around the United States. And I would say we're kind of in luck for the amok because we've lost our top order predators. We don't have mountain lions walking down Wilshire Boulevard, only on occasion, but not regularly. We have them at the wild lane interface. We don't have wolves. And so therefore, the middle-sized mammals that can be really problematic to humans have no predators. And so when coyotes come in, they become the de facto top order predators, even though in an ecological guild they would be considered mesopredators. But they're synanthropes. They get along very well with humans as long as we don't feed them and subsidize them, so they think of themselves as being semi-domesticated. We're in a relationship with coyotes that humans were 20,000 years ago with dogs, when the first wolves moved into those communities. We don't need another domestic species. We have dogs. So we need to keep coyotes wild. And when they are wild, the services they provide are incredibly important. One of which is to reduce the feral cat population. And in areas where feral cats and coyotes live, coyotes don't actually eat all that many feral cats. Ask us how we know. 250 piles of coyote poop later, we can tell you exactly what a coyote eats. Although it's hard to tell when they're eating people food, because people food is so highly processed, it doesn't leave any telltale signals. Because most of us are not happy when we get hair in our food or bones, so we don't eat any of those things, so we don't leave the hard parts. But coyotes don't eat a lot of, and when coyotes eat, they're not that delicate. Hair, anything, it all just goes right down. Because they don't, their teeth are for tearing, not for chewing. So they tear and gulp, everything goes in. And so you get a really good idea of what they're actually eating. And so when they've been in a community for a while, they don't eat many cats, but the cats completely change their behavior because they can only hunt when the coyotes aren't around. As a result, local bird populations come back and flourish. And as a result, top-down pressure on insects increases. The birds are back, they're eating the insects, and therefore human risk to zoonotic disease is reduced. West Nile virus, Zika. We really want to control those challenges that we face, zoonotic diseases. We need to bring back our insectivorous birds. And how do we do that? We need to control the rodents and the cats. And coyotes will do that for us. We don't even have to pay them. We just have to stop poisoning them and stop feeding them and subsidizing them. So this is an interesting interaction. This is urban ecology at work. And by the way, our students, the radiotelemetry studies that were being done in Boston, which we did for almost 20 years, those were high school kids working with their teachers and us, trapping and putting radio collars on and managing this coyote study and managing this coyote project. In addition, when we get cities right, we can have hyperdense communities. But if we have enough green space, if we have the tendrils of green space that move, in Los Angeles is actually full of green space. We don't always recognize it. We have the things that we recognize like Baldwin Hills, or we think of the big parks, or we think of the Bionda wetlands. But there's a green connector that runs between. Some of it are the alleyways that can be transformed, as well as pocket parks and rain gardens and things like that. This school becomes a critical stopping ground for migratory birds and insects as they move along their way. So we get lower levels of fear, less violence and aggressive behavior, fewer crimes, healthier children, better neighbor relations. There are pathways to success. So we're going to talk about the curriculum in just a second, and I know I'm standing between you and lunch, which is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. So eventually your stomach growling, and just get up and walk out. I won't, in fact, stop talking, as my wife will say. You'll just stare at something and continue. So at the Urban Ecology Institute, we have a full-time staff of about 12 people. We're housed at the university. All of our staff is supported by grants and contracts we bring in. So my salary is supported by the university. I'm a professor there, but everybody else is support we have to bring in. And we have 3 divisions. We have our so-called resilient schools and neighborhoods. So we have our urban eco-lab curriculum and educator support program, which will be the focus of the last few minutes of my talk. We also have a restorative justice program that goes with all of our schools. So somebody's here from Aspire. We have a big program in the Aspire schools. That's Shana Mahmood and who's there. And we feel very strongly that managing the behavioral challenges in your schools in ways that you don't lose your students to expulsion or suspension is a very powerful solution. And we've taken this project on. It's been very, very successful to link these 2 programs together. And then we also run the Ballona Discovery Park, which is adjacent to the Ballona wetlands and serves as a living laboratory, which I hope you'll come and visit. Then we do basic biosocial research, and this is where the citizen science piece comes on. We have an urban animal initiative that we're doing with the Annenberg Foundation, where we're studying this interface between wild and domestic animals. We have a big initiative on the human-animal bond and its role in helping healthy communities. As you may know, the Annenberg Foundation is building a new pet center in Playa Vista on private land. And it's going to be a center for learning, a center for pet adoption, a center for the development of best practices. We're developing the curriculum for them. We're writing a book about this project and so forth. We also do stewardship mapping and network analysis. We just completed an analysis of the 800 not-for-profit environmental groups here in Los Angeles. Didn't know there were 800 till we did the analysis. And we're looking at their spatial and interactive relationships with one another. And if you go to our website, you can see some of these maps that we've developed. We've done it in Seattle and Baltimore. And it helps agencies understand who's the most connected with respect to these environmental organizations. Because some of them do great work, but they're not actually talking to the other environmental groups. You have to create a network to be really effective. And then we have a big project in urban forestry. We just recounted and reanalyzed the urban canopy for coastal Los Angeles. So we've gotten it down to the sub 1 meter resolution. We now know exactly what trees are in each parcel in Los Angeles, which helps us to ask questions about equity and about social justice with respect to green space. And those maps are all available. We have more funding. We're going to finish the rest of Los Angeles County this year. And then under transforming the discipline, we published the journal Cities and Environment, which is a highly competitive journal, but we don't have page charges, we don't have subscription fees. We raise all the money so that communities can publish their work even if they can't afford subscription or page fees. Those of us who traditionally publish, I just had a Coyote paper published with a colleague of mine. The page charges, this is a very competitive journal. It took us 2 years in order to get it accepted. It was still a $4,000 page charge to publish those findings. And so if you're not, what's that? The authors have to... Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, so not only they charge you to read the journal, they charge authors. Now some of them are pay-for-play journals that you pay them, they'll publish anything. But even the top journals like Science, Nature, they all have high page charges. Yeah, so you're doing work, and if you're publishing 3 or 4 refereed journal articles a year, that's a lot of money to come up with. And so you're supposed to pay for it with your grants and so forth. We run the Urban Ecology Graduate Program. We have a Mediterranean Cities Climate Change Consortium, where we're working with the various cities that have similar climate to us: Santiago, Chile, Brisbane, Australia, Cape Town, South Africa, Israel, and of course the cities that touch the Mediterranean. And so there was a conversation before about pen pals with like-minded high schools. We have those connections in similar ecotypes. And then we do a lot of program consultancy. People bring us on, whether like, 2 recent acquisitions with Southern California Gas, Southern California Edison. Notice the Aliso Canyon debacle was on my lips. That was a huge public relations disaster for Southern California Gas, and they weren't prepared for it, and they're kind of old school, thinking we're the ones who control flipping on the lights and turning on the switches, so all we got to do is worry about that. Well, no. You have to engage, and you have to be live, and you have to respond to the changing demographics of those communities. And so they kind of get it, and they're bringing us on to help them think in a more modern way about how they're really in service to their communities. But this gets me to the kind of core and the take-home message here. And I'm speaking to the I'm preaching to the choir, as it were. I'm from a Jesuit university, so I guess that's an apt metaphor. Although it is kind of funny, I think, because it's a Catholic university, and my mother was Lutheran, and my father was Jewish, and I promised not to try and insult anyone while I was there, and you can help me work through all of this. Nail nothing to the door, no theses. So it's been a delight. I mean, I love working at Jesuit universities because of this commitment to the community and the commitment to knowledge, the commitment to skeptical investigation. You know, leave no idea untrammeled. It's safe and important sort of to kind of beat the crap out of an idea until we really understand, in a loving way, of course, until we really understand where the truth is, or as best we can. And also the other crazy thing, especially for those of your STEM teachers, half of what you're teaching your students now won't be true in 20 years. I look at my first textbook that I did in 1996. And we put our hearts and soul into that textbook. It did very well. And I read it now and go, that's not really true anymore. And oh my goodness, that's not how they bind. That's not how they oscillate. I mean, oh my goodness. So the facts, we live in a post-factual world, as some of our presidential candidates are so comfortable with. But even if we're meaning well, this post-factual world we live in means we have to build in our students not the rote memorization of the facts, but the ability to be comfortable with new ideas, because they're going to have to change what they know about the world. So our mission in developing this Urban Ecolab curriculum is to engage students in inquiry-based learning across many fields of scholarship in order to develop skills in sustainability, resilience theory, and action outcomes. And so each of these, and we're not going to have time to really explore them all that much, each of these particular projects have curriculum built around them, somewhere between 8 and 15 lessons. So the projects don't have to be single day or after school events. They can be, but they can actually be integrated, because you've got next gen science standards to meet, you've got your state standards to meet. There are some schools we work in where they have to write the standard on the board before every lesson. And that kind of accountability may seem unwieldy, but that's the reality. If we pretend it's not there, then we're not really in service to your needs. So we have projects in urban design, we have projects in hummingbird foraging ecology, tree swallow nesting ecology, local garden biodiversity, mesopredator studies, public health and food security, urban trees and public health, urban bioacoustics, all supported by a variety of curricula and action activities that you can do. Our philosophy around our curriculum is not the traditional scientific method, which, by the way, no working scientist actually follows. But you know, we put it up there on the wall and remind ourselves that we don't actually do it this way, or we won't get funded, we won't get published, and you know. So we talk about science. We need to understand science. We need to do science, and then we need to act on it. Science needs to be informing our relationship to community. We were launched this project through the NSF iTest program. We were one of 6 projects chosen from 120 and 37 different states to try and develop this curriculum. After about 5 years of doing this work, we've shown that students' self-confidence has increased, their interest has increased, their civic responsibility has increased with respect to our control student populations. So what is this curriculum? It's called Urban Ecolab, How Healthy is My City? And remember, you can download all the lessons, all the teacher prep, all the rubrics, all the narratives, all the multimedia from our website. It makes the folks at Pearson who considered that they would partner with us until we said, we're not going to charge people for this. They were like, their head just exploded and they walked away. And so we have 8 modules right now. We're working on 3 more additional ones. For those of you who encountered these curricula 5 years ago, you know they were very Boston-centric. But over the past 5 years, we have a variety of teacher leaders who've helped us make it more Los Angeles specific, so the individual examples that we're doing. So Module 1 is an introduction to urban ecology. Module 2 is patterns of land use. Module 3 is energy and climate change. Module 4 is garbage and hazardous waste. Module 5 is public health. Module 6 is diversity. Module 7 is animal behavior. And Module 8 is taking action. This is the social justice section, although those are woven into the other components. We're now doing one on or 3 more, urban agriculture, human-animal bond, and then we have an emerging one on urban ethics and how that relates to science. So very quickly, let me give you just an example of the bioacoustics, because I think it helps to shape how we provide services to you. And there was somebody that in the last workshop who teaches physics. And in fact, this module gets used a lot in physics because it works with the physics of waves. So the question is, or the idea is, that cities are really noisy places. In fact, there's this low rumble in cities that are characteristic. And by the way, if you work in bioacoustics like I do, different cities have different characteristic signature sounds. And if you spend enough time doing it, you go, oh, that's New York. Ah, that's a coastal city because of the fact there's an ocean on one side. So very interesting. And we link this sound to its behavioral impact on birds. And so students using equipment we provide to schools, digital recorders and software, they record the sound of their cities and they record birdsong. They can then make spectrograms and spectrographs of those waveforms. And they can learn to recognize different species of birds by the waveform that they produce. You can hear it, but you can actually see it. So when you hear the difference between a house finch and a house sparrow, you can hear it. You can see their different plumage, but now you can actually map what the waveform looks like. And one of the more interesting things, in 2003, there was a paper published in Europe that showed that certain species of birds, those that are most successful in cities, the synanthropes, are able to adjust the waveform of their calls in response to urban noise. They change their voice, just like we do, right? When, let's say we're in a crowded event and we're trying to talk to somebody next to us, we get louder, we make it simple, and we raise the pitch. These birds do the same thing. And students can record these birds in quiet and loud times and see the difference in waveform and begin to make predictions. They're making sound maps of their neighborhoods and so forth. It allows them to conduct this investigation, develop a question, analyze the data, present the data to classmates, local science, and science educators. And all of our different modules are organized the same way. You have this process. So what we suggest is that your school pick a couple of the projects. We provide the equipment for you. If you want a garden, we'll come and plant it for you. If you want bird boxes, we'll install them for you. And then our staff makes regular visits to make sure that it's working right for you. And how do we support teachers? One, we provide these 100+ lessons, teacher preps, multimedia, narratives, activities, all free on the website. We have monthly teacher workshops at LMU, usually the second Saturday of the month. We have summer institutes in Los Angeles and Boston that run sort of right when class gets out in July. You've been out for a little bit, but you're not leaving for your vacations yet, we hope. You get support from our staff to set up your research projects at your school site. You get ongoing support. And here's what I think is also really important. We provide teacher stipends and fellowships for your participation in curriculum development. You folks are professionals. You shouldn't have to volunteer your time all the time when you're not in the classroom. We need to recognize that. And as long as we have the federal support that we do and support from the Annenberg Foundation, so for instance this year, our teacher stipends and our summer institute stipends are being provided by the Annenberg Foundation because they see this is so important in educating our next generation of young people. So we don't have enough time today, and it's almost noon, to go into these in detail, but what I'm going to do is leave flyers for you and ways to contact us. Because what we'd like to do is do consultations with your schools. I'd like to bring my, so two of our staff who couldn't be here today because they're celebrating Rosh Hashanah, Stacy Sinclair, who's our Director of Education, and Laurel Hunt, who's our Director of Strategic Partnerships. So both of them are recognizing the holiday today, and they're not here. They're here in spirit, but they would normally be here, and they are the ones who are, along with myself, that go to your schools and figure out how we can, or what studies might work best, what are some of the easiest ways to implement. The hummingbird studies are very easy. You put in the feeders, and within a few hours, you can do foraging studies. You can set up little web-based cameras. You can actually broadcast locally or in the larger web what you're actually seeing so students can gather data and so forth, all the way up to high schools that we have that are capturing and putting radio transmitters on animals and tracking them. And we've actually used this curricula and turned it into an ELL curriculum for English language learners because the idea of narrative and story around urban ecology is so powerful. Magali Lavidens, who's a senior professor at LMU in the School of Ed, is my partner in the middle school program. So we have middle school, we have high school, and at our workshops, we have lots of elementary school teachers come along. And then what we can do is take those lessons and help you kind of turn them a little bit. Because they rely on this notion of observation and engagement. You can do the same lesson with the same students every couple of years, and their intellectual development's growing. You can begin to ask the questions differently. I mean, in the first module, you take a hula hoop and you toss it, and you start doing some careful observation about what is inside that hoop. What's above that hoop? Without trying to get to species, without trying to get technical, what are the kinds of things? What's biologic here? What's non-living? What's human-produced? Begin to develop these observational skills so that as you walk out into the world, you can gather more kinds of data. Here's some images of us putting up, building and putting up the tree swallow boxes. Tree swallow boxes, by the way, are built by high school students in our partner school at Westchester High School. We built 300 of them for the community. Here they are in use. Fascinating animals, insect-eating animals, birds, and they're very, very social, very, very complex. So there's lots of data, interesting data to gather. These are two males that are inspecting this box, and a female's on the inside. And we have remote cameras. You can see the young when they hatch out on the inside in real time, so students can watch that developing. Here they are after they fledged. And they're, like all children, almost always dependent on their parents. At some point in their lives, there's mom coming back in, and all of a sudden the mouths are open. Mom, feed me, feed me. So let me stop there. It was exactly an hour, so thank you very much. And I hope to hear from you.